Look at this Celtic hill fort. It was the only protection against the strength of the Roman army, and yet the Celts survived the Roman occupation of Britain.
For 367 years, Britain was under Roman control. But the story of that occupation isn't just about legions and emperors, it's about resistance, survival and cultural fusion. Because while Rome conquered much of Britain, the Celts never truly disappeared. The Celtic people had been living in Britain for centuries prior to the Roman invasion. They lived under tribal structures, primarily as farmers. Although that's not to say they lived in the dark about their European neighbours. In fact, there was a thriving copper trade in the Bronze Age that linked Britain and mainland Europe. Before the Roman invasion, some Celtic leaders were even adopting their own coinage in the Roman style, a clear sign that the people of Britain were aware of their contemporaries. The Romans had first attempted to invade Britain in 55 BC under Julius Caesar, and then later under Caligula, the first primarily being symbolic, and the second failing to even get started. But the hammer blow came in 43 AD with the Claudian invasion of Britain. One of the first to stand against Rome was Caratacus, prince of the Catuvellauni tribe. His tribe had already expanded aggressively into southeastern Britain, and they met the Romans head-on at the Battle of the Medway. The Celtic tribes united under Caratacus and his brother, ready to make their stand on a riverbank. The fighting was brutal and lasted for 3 days, with the Romans having to cross the river as there was no bridge in sight. However, the Celts could not hold off the large Roman force and were eventually defeated and had to retreat northwards and westwards as the Romans followed closely behind them.
The Roman army was nearly unstoppable, but the Britons had a secret weapon: their terrain. The Caledonian forests in the north and the mountains of Wales in the west made marching legions vulnerable to ambush. The tribes like the Silures and the Ordovices made these places their natural strongholds from which they could launch their attacks.
If we look to Tacitus, we find Caratacus once again. Caratacus fled west. He became a warlord in the mountains, leading fierce resistance for nearly a decade.
Caratacus led one of the longest resistance campaigns against the Romans. After fleeing west, he united with the Silures and Ordovices, and he fought guerrilla warfare in the mountains of Wales from Welsh hill forts. However, eventually in 50 AD, he was finally defeated, but he narrowly managed to escape north to the Brigantes tribe.
Caratacus was clearly a strong figure, who was fighting for the independence of his lands. But that wouldn't last forever. We'll pick up Caratacus' story later. Boudica is most well known for her revolt, but prior to this, her husband Prasutagus, king of the Iceni, had been allied to the Romans, although everything was about to change.
After the death of her husband Prasutagus in AD 60, Rome annexed the Iceni lands, and they brutally punished Queen Boudica. In response, she led her own revolt against the towns of Camulodunum and Londinium, Colchester and London. The revolt was put down by the governor Suetonius, although it shook Rome to its very core.
Tacitus describes the uprising as an immense host of the barbarians, and calls them fierce in spirit. Despite their large numbers and unwavering determination, the rebellion was eventually crushed at an unknown location, possibly near Watling Street. But Boudica's legend lived on. In the centuries that followed, she became a symbol of national resistance. But not everyone would choose to resist the Romans.
Cartimandua, queen of the Brigantes, took a different path entirely. She handed over Caratacus in return for her own political protection and to secure the Brigantes tribe. It was controversial, although it did mean that when other tribes were getting wiped out, the Brigantes held firm.
Caratacus was transported to Rome in chains, but he made an impact even there. He impressed the Roman Senate so much that they allowed him to keep his life. He was pardoned and lived the rest of his life in Rome. Cartimandua was clearly smart and knew that she would have to adapt to her new surroundings in order to maintain her peoples. This is even noticed by Tacitus. Cartimandua, with all her womanly cunning, preserved her power through favour and politics. Although, when Cartimandua divorced her husband Venutius, he would lead an army against her. But the alliance she had with Rome meant that the governor, Aulus Didius Gallus, sent in the infamous 9th Legion Hispania to uphold Cartimandua's reign, a clear sign that the alliance with Rome could turn out to be incredibly useful. Some leaders took it one step further and became practically indistinguishable from the Romans. Tiberius Claudius Togidubnus wasn't a Roman. He was king of the Regni tribe in southern Britain, and he embraced Roman culture from the outset. The Roman-style palace at Fishbourne is complete with mosaics, bathhouses, and underfloor heating. Some have suggested that this was Toggy Dubnus' royal seat of power.
Romanisation was never total. In places like Bath, Celtic gods such as Sulis continue to be worshipped but under different names, such as Sulis Minerva, which the Romano-British adopted. And so these Celtic traditions were able to persist even though the Romans were bearing down on them. And thus when the Romans eventually left, they could readopt those Celtic gods even after 400 years of occupation.
In the year 410 AD, the last Roman officials and legions withdrew from Britain. The empire was under siege back home, and the distant province of Britannia was no longer a priority. The imperial safety net, army, administration, economy vanished almost overnight. But what about the people that had lived under Roman rule for generations? Well, they remained. By this point, many Celtic Britons were Romanized, at least on the surface. They spoke Latin alongside their native tongues, used Roman tools, worshipped in Roman temples, and walked on Roman-built roads. But as the Roman infrastructure collapsed, so too did many of its imposed systems. Without tax collectors, magistrates, or garrisons, local tribe identities began to re-emerge. In some places, old hill forts were reoccupied. In others, small post-Roman kingdoms began to form, each rooted in the earlier Celtic tribal map. These kingdoms weren't Roman, but they weren't untouched either. They were hybrids, Celtic in blood and language, but shaped by centuries of Roman influence. Celtic religion also adapted. The Roman gods faded, but the fusion of local deities with Roman ones helped ease the transition. In Bath, for example, the goddess Sulis Minerva was no longer worshipped as such, but the sacred spring remained a place of healing and reverence for centuries. And then there was language. Despite Roman rule lasting for nearly 400 years, Britain never became a Romance-speaking land. Latin influenced the vocabulary, adding over 800 words, but it never replaced the native Brittonic languages. In fact, modern Welsh, Cornish and Breton all descend directly from these post-Roman dialects. This makes Britain an anomaly. In Gaul, Latin became French, in Iberia, Spanish and Portuguese. But in Britain, the Celtic voice continued to speak, even under centuries of pressure. So how did the Celts survive the Roman occupation? They adapted. They resisted when they had to, compromised when they needed to, and absorbed what served them. Roman Britain came and went, but beneath it all, the Celtic spirit endured. Not just in hidden valleys and distant hills, but in language, custom, belief and identity, passed from generation to generation. The Romans left Britain, but the Celts never did. However, the Celtic tribes would not have long before a new group would land on their shores, a new test of resistance and endurance. This time, the Angles, Saxons, Jutes and Frisians, a group that would push them westwards into the territories of Cornwall, Wales and Strathclyde. That group would go on to become the Anglo-Saxons, taking over what is now England and making it their own.